In this video we're going to create a heart-shaped jigsaw puzzle. I'm assuming that you have watched Creating Spline Shapes in Cinema 4D Part 1, or that you know how to use the spline tools, because we're going to move along fairly quickly in this tutorial. Also, you will need at least Cinema 4D Release 17. You can see I'm running Release 18 broadcast here. Or you will need Cinema 4D Lite, which is part of Adobe After Effects CC. In this tutorial I'm also going to use a free plugin called Magic Mirror Spline, and of course you will need the reference image. I have provided download links to both the plugin and the reference image under the video. So now we're all set and we can go ahead and model the outline of our heart shape in the next video. In this video we're going to model the outline of our heart-shaped jigsaw puzzle. First of all, I'm going to load a reference image into my front view, and I'm going to change the size to 1500 and make the image a little more transparent. And maybe we could move it over a little bit on the x-axis. Now you will see that this image is not perfectly symmetrical, and I'm also going to take some artistic freedoms because I don't really like the outline as it is in the reference image. So up here I think we could make this a little rounder, and down here I don't really like that straight line. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a slight curve. So let's grab the pen tool. We can use the default settings here. And I'm going to create a first point here. And I'm just going to drag out the handles like this. And then we can drag the top handle out a bit further, like so. The next point I'm going to create here. And I want to put it right where that gap is, because later we're going to subtract the gap splines from the outline and we can get rid of this point again. If we put it on one of the puzzle pieces, we're going to have 2 points very close to each other, which is something that I want to avoid. So I'm going to drag a point out here. And then we only need one more point, maybe down here. Next I'm going to select all of the points and I'm going to modify the tangents and try to create the outline that we want. So let's drag this up a little bit, and I'm going to drag this tangent up a bit and then tweak this tangent again. And we need to pull this one out a little bit further. So something like this looks good, I think. So we're getting a nicer curve up here. We're going beyond what we see in the reference image, but I think the shape will look a little bit nicer. Now let's switch on lock tangent rotation, and I'm going to make this tangent here a little bit longer, and you can see we get a nice curve going here. And on this point down here I will rotate the tangents a little bit and line them up with our spline. Next I want to test the shape of my spline, and for this I'm going to use the free plugin I mentioned in the first video, which is called Magic Mirror Spline. So let's add this to the scene, and we get this object here, and Magic Mirror Spline is like a symmetry object, only it's meant to be used with splines. And it can do a few things that we can't do with the standard Cinema 4D symmetry object. So if I drag the spline into the symmetry object and make it a child of the Magic Mirror Spline object, you can see our spline gets mirrored over to the left. And if I select Magic Mirror Spline again, you can see we only have a few options. We can select the plane. In this case, it's XY, which is perfect. And we can choose to connect the spline or not to connect the spline. In this case, I do want to connect the spline. So you can see our spline is closed up here. If you have a point at the center on the mirror plane, using Magic Mirror Spline and making it editable will automatically weld the points together, so you don't have to do that manually. Also, unlike the symmetry object, we can make the Magic Mirror Spline object editable without converting the spline. In order to test the shape, I'm going to put the Magic Mirror Spline object in an extrude object, and now we can render our shape and see how it looks. So you can see it's looking pretty good already. We don't even have to tweak the point up here. We're getting a nice looking curve, and we're getting our soft curve down here. However, we need to tweak the point down here a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to grab my pen tool again, lock tangent rotation, and let's select our spline. And I'm just going to drag this tangent out a little bit further to maybe here. So I think that's looking pretty good. And now we can make the Magic Mirror Spline object editable, and let's rename this to Hard Outline. In the next video, we're going to create a template for the gap splines that we need to create the puzzle pieces. Before I continue, I want to rotate the reference image around 45 degrees. And by doing that, we're getting horizontal and vertical lines here, which will make it a lot easier to create these rows of puzzle pieces. I'm also going to rotate the hard outline 45 degrees. All of the protrusions pretty much have the same shape, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a nice one that I'm going to use for the gap spline, and I think it's going to be this one here. In this video, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to modeling the gap spline. For this one, for example, I'm going to start with a helper spline, and I'll explain why we need that in a minute. So let's grab our pen tool, and I'm going to switch the type from Bezier to linear so we can draw straight lines. And now we just need to left click to create points, and we don't need any tangents for these, which is why I switched the type to linear. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line these points up with that black line in the reference image. So something like this. And over here things are looking pretty good. So let's deselect the spline. In fact, I'll switch it off for now. And let's grab the pen tool again, switch it back to Bezier, and now we're going to draw our outline for the gap spline. I'm going to put the first point at the center of this shape here, and we're going to need another point about here, one down here, and here. And for the last point, we don't need any tangents, so I'm just going to left click to create that point somewhere over here. And I'm going beyond that vertical line a bit in order to make sure that once we combine all of these gap splines, we get an intersection with the outline, because we need to make sure we can subtract our gap splines from the outline later. The reason I created the helper spline is because I want to make sure that I'm getting straight lines here and here. Now, of course, what we could do is we could get rid of one of these tangents and thus get a straight line. And sometimes that will work, but sometimes what you get is a corner, and I want a smooth transition from this curve to that straight line. And the best way to do that is to keep both handles. However, we need to make sure that the tangents of the points here are perfectly lined up with our spline to get that straight line. And the easiest way to do that is by using a helper spline. So I'm going to go back a few steps so I have both tangents again, and let's switch on our helper spline. And next we need to switch on snapping, and we want to make sure that we snap to splines. And now I'm going to select my Gap Spline and start snapping the points to the helper spline. And now we can start snapping the tangents to the helper spline. And by doing this, we can make sure that we get a perfectly straight line. Okay, so now we can switch off snapping again, and let's switch off the helper spline, and we can start tweaking the tangents to get the shape that we want. And maybe I'm going to move this top point down a little bit further. I'm also going to open the values and tangents window, and let's make sure that our tangents on this top point are perfectly horizontal. So now we can select the pen tool again, make sure that lock tangent rotation is switched on, and we can start modifying those tangents. Something like this maybe. Next I want to test how this gap spline looks, so we have to close the spline, and I'm going to create an additional point on this line and drag this over somewhere to here, and let's add an extrude object and render this. And I think it's looking pretty much perfect down here, and up here, let's see, I don't really like that shape yet. Maybe we could select this point here and drag out this tangent a little bit further. Yeah, or maybe let's move it back a bit. So I think this is looking pretty good. So let's select this point, delete it, and uncheck close spline again. In the next video, we're going to create the outline, and I'm also going to use a slightly different technique for creating that outline. So let's go ahead and do that in the next video. In order to create the outline, we're going to use another helper spline. First of all, I'm going to clean up my object manager a little bit, and I'm also going to switch off the reference image for now. And next I'm going to put the object axis of this spline to the point at the top here. So let's go to model mode and bring up axis center. We have to move the axis all the way to the top and all the way over to the left. And by doing that, we're not putting the axis exactly on the point, and the reason is because this point has two tangents, and Cinema4D will put the object axis at the end of this tangent here. So what I'm going to do in order to fix that is I'm going to enable axis, switch on snapping, and I'm going to move the object axis over and snap it to that top point. Now we can make a copy and rotate this copy minus 180 degrees. And let's connect both of these splines. And I'm going to weld the points at the top. So this is our gap spline. I'm going to make a copy of this spline and call this helper gap. And what I'll do with this spline is I'm going to select all the points and I'm going to right click and use subdivide. Let's click on the options to bring up this window here, and I'm going to use 8 subdivisions. Let's create a lot of points, and by creating so many points we will get a very even outline. So let's create an outline for this spline, and 5 is a bit wide and also it's going in the wrong direction, so I'm going to undo and let's do something like -3 for the distance. Also, I'm going to change the color for this spline, and let's do something that we can really see very well, like bright yellow. Okay, so let's select our other gap spline and let's go to point mode, and I'm going to use create outline again, and also I'm going to do a distance of -3, and you can see that it doesn't work. The outline is created in the other direction, so we have to go back a step and enter +3 for the distance instead. And you can already see that in most areas our gap spline is perfectly following the lines on the helper spline. It's just a few areas down here and up here that we need to tweak. So first of all, I'm going to select this point here at the top, and we can simply scale this a little bit and try to line it up with the lines on the helper spline. Down here I'm going to select these 2 points and I'm going to use the pen tool, make sure lock tangent rotation is switched on, and we're going to drag these tangents back just a little bit. So maybe I could drag this one back just a little bit further. It doesn't have to be perfect. And now if we put this in an extrude object, you can see we're getting a nice and even outline. And over here you can see that this area is a bit wider than over here. Okay, so that's perfect. Let's make the helper spline invisible. I'm going to delete this extrude object, and on our finished gap spline I'm going to select these points over here, disconnect them and delete them. I'm going to delete these 2 points. Let's make sure that these 2 points are at 0 on the x-axis, which they are. And now we can make a copy of this spline, go back to model mode and rotate the copy, and then combine these 2 splines. And I'm going to weld these 2 points up here and then close our spline. Now, in order to be able to connect all the copies of this gap spline, we need the spline to be open at this end and also at this end over here. If I uncheck close spline, we still have the opening up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this point here and set it as the first point. So we're getting an opening here. And in order to get the opening at this end here, I'm going to use the knife tool, make a cut here, select this point and disconnect it, select this point again. We now have 3 points and we need to delete all of these. So now we have an open end on the right and on the left, and that will make it much easier later on to combine the individual gap splines. Now let's go to model mode and bring up axis center again. I'm going to reset the parameters and hit execute, and this one will be our horizontal gap spline that's facing upwards. So I'm calling this H up, and I'm going to make a copy and call this H down. And let's rotate this 180 degrees. And I'm going to reset the axis to 0. And we're done. So these are the two templates, and in the next video we're going to create the rows for the puzzle pieces. In this video we're going to take the templates and create the rows for the puzzle pieces. And we only really have to do one of these rows because we have alternating pieces, which means we have protrusions facing down, up, or left, right. And we're going to do the longest row, which is this one here. So just in case, I'm going to make a copy of the two templates that we made, and I'm going to move the one that's facing down roughly into position over here. And we have to snap all the gap splines together, so I'm going to move the object axis of each of these two splines. So let's switch on enable axis and snapping, and I'm going to move the object axis and snap it to this point here. On the other spline, I'm going to move the object axis over to here. So I'm going to move this up and put it into position about here, and let's make a copy, move it over, and we'll need another copy, and let's move this over to here. And I'm going to make some copies of the spline that's facing down. So now I'm going to move all of these splines into position. So let's select each of these and line them up with a reference image. Okay. So now what we have to do is snap the splines to each other, and I'm going to switch off the background image, and let's select this spline, and I'm going to switch on snapping. Make sure you have spline snap selected here, and I'm just going to move this spline down and snap it to the other one, and we're going to do this for the other splines as well. And next we can select all of these splines here and connect them. And of course the segments are not yet connected, so let's switch off snapping, grab one of the selection tools, and I'm going to select these 2 points here, right click and weld them together by left clicking anywhere in the viewport. And if you hit spacebar, you can go back to the last tool you used, which is the Lite selection in this case. And I'm going to select these points, hit spacebar, weld these points together, spacebar, select these 2 points and delete them. And we're going to repeat this process for the rest of this row as well. So 2 more to go. Okay, so this is the first row finished. And you can see the spline is not really matching up with the reference image, but that's okay. If we start moving those points around, we're also going to change the curves down here, and we will get corners. And the lines we tried to make straight when we created the gap splines will no longer be straight. So it's okay to deviate a bit from the reference image. I'd rather keep the shapes consistent and perfect. So now we have finished our first row, and we can use this as a template. Let's call this template horizontal, and we can use this spline to create all of the other rows for the jigsaw puzzle. So now we can use our new template to create the other horizontal and also the vertical rows. I'm going to make a copy of this template here, and we're going to use this one for the vertical rows. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees or minus 90 degrees and just make it invisible for now. We're going to deal with the horizontal rows first. So I'm going to move this one up to about here, and let's make a copy, move it down to here and rotate it. I'm going to move this down a little bit further, and let's make a copy of this one, move it down to here, copy this one, move it down to here, and we need one more copy of this one, and let's move this down to here. So we have to make some adjustments to some of these horizontal rows. Let's start with the top one. I'm going to move this into position, and everything's looking fine over here, but on the left we have to move the protrusion over to the right a little bit. So let's go to point mode and select these points here, and I'm going to move these over. Now this will change the curves here, and we will lose our straight lines. So what I'm going to do to fix this segment in between these points here is I'm going to make a copy and use this as a helper spline. And let's switch on snapping and grab the pen tool. I'm going to lock the tangent length here, and now we can rotate these tangents back into position. And we also have to adjust these ones here. Over here we can get rid of these points, and let's delete the helper spline again. And over here on the right I'm just going to delete all of these points here and set these ones to hard interpolation. The next row seems to be looking pretty good, but we have to terminate it right here. So I'm going to make a cut right here. So we have to make sure that this spline intersects with the vertical spline we're going to create. And now we can just delete all of these points here, and again I'm going to set these to hard interpolation. This was our original row. We don't really have to tweak anything here, so let's move on to the next one. And this one is looking pretty good as well. If you want to, you could rotate this one a little bit and line it up a little more accurately with the reference image. And on the last one we have to make some adjustments over here. So let's move these points over a little bit to about here maybe, and I'm going to make a copy and use this as a helper spline. And let's grab the pen tool again and rotate some of the tensions back into position. So let's get rid of the helper spline, and I'm going to rotate this into position. So now we can select all of the horizontal rows and connect these splines. And we're done. In the next video we're going to take care of the vertical rows. So now let's take care of the vertical rows. I'm going to move the first one here into position. Let's maybe switch off snapping. And I'm going to line this up with the protrusion down here. And let's make a copy and rotate the copy and move it over a bit. And I'm going to make a copy of the first one and move that into position over here. Then we need another copy of this one and move it over to about here. And let's make one more copy of this one and put it over here. So we'll start with the vertical row on the left, and we don't really have to do anything except at the top here where we have to get rid of the protrusion. So I'm going to delete these points here, set these ones to hard interpolation and just move them up a bit. And let's go ahead and check the tensions on these 2 points here. And they're off just a little bit, so I don't think we have to tweak these. So let's move on to the next row. And this one I'm going to rotate a little bit. Same for this one. Let's rotate this over just a little bit. And on this one we have to do a few more adjustments. So I think I'm also going to rotate this a bit. And then I'm going to delete all the points up here. Change these ones to hard interpolation. And I'm going to move these over to maybe here. And now we have to adjust the tensions on these 2 points to get a nice curve going. And I'm going to switch off the reference image for now so we can see our splines a little better. Let's grab the pen tool, and I want to switch on lock tangent rotation, and let's adjust these tangents a little bit and do something like this. So that's looking good. I'm going to switch on the reference image again, and let's move on to that last row on the right here. So over here I'm getting rid of the points at the top. Setting these ones to hard interpolation, and down here we have to delete the bottom protrusion. And I'm going to move these points down a bit. And again, let's check these 2 points, make sure the tangents are lined up with the spline. So I don't think we have to do any tweaking here. This is looking good. And now we can select all of the vertical rows and use connect objects and delete to create a single spline. In the next video we're going to combine the vertical and the horizontal rows, and we're going to finish our heart-shaped jigsaw puzzle. In order to be able to connect the vertical rows with the horizontal rows, we have to make sure that our splines are closed. Right now our splines are open here at the bottom and at the top, And that means that each of these vertical rows consists of two separate segments. If I try to close that spline, what happens is that Cinema 4D will close each of these segments and not the rows. So what we have to do in order to prevent this from happening is we have to join the segments first. And we can do that by selecting 2 points down here, for example, and then using join segment. And we have to do this for all of the points down here. And now we should be able to close this spline. And you can see that our gaps have been closed up here as well. So now we have a spline that we can use with the spline mask object. And of course we have to do the same thing for the horizontal rows. So I'm going to select 2 points here and here and join all of these segments. Then we can close the spline. So now we can put the splines into a spline mask object and combine them. And let's make the spline mask object editable. And next I'm going to put the heart outline into a spline mask object. I'm going to add our gap splines. Let's call this heart. And we have to change the mode of this spline mask object from union to A subtract B. And let's make it editable. Go back to model mode. I'm going to reset the rotation to 0. And I'm also going to rotate the reference image back to 0. And now let's add an extrude object, and I'm going to change the movement to maybe 10. And also let's add some fillet caps. And we have to make the radius quite a bit smaller. Let's try 1. And I'm also going to stick with 1 for the steps. If you want more detail, you can add more steps. But for this example, I'm going to stick with just 1 step. And I think we could increase the radius a little bit. So let's do maybe 1.2. And that's looking pretty good. Let's do a close-up of one of these protrusions here. And I think we can be pretty happy with the result. We got some very nice curves going, the straight lines are really straight, and the distance between the puzzle pieces is very even. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching everyone, and take care.